Welcome to Schloss Leopoldskron and the Salzburg Global Seminar. My guest is Guy de Jonquieres, Senior Fellow at the European Centre for International Political Economy and a former journalist for the Financial Times. And Guy, you have been co-chairing a session here in Salzburg on Asian integration and security. So I think my first question is, in the context of this seminar, what is the Asian region?
It's an extremely good question, and one which we have been grappling with for the last 3 days without any very clear answers. And the so-called Asian participants here, are equally puzzled and sceptical and perplexed about what Asia means, because you're talking about a region that stretches on the normal definition all the way from the Bosporus right across to Taiwan and arguably even beyond into the South Pacific. So this is so diverse, so vast, and within it, of course, you have massive differences of culture, of religion, of political system, and no common values of a kind that broadly tend to unite European countries. So it's actually extremely difficult to answer that, and I suspect I'd be very interested to see how we end up.
Are there any lessons that could be learned from Europe? Is it at all relevant, the European experience, the EU, in terms of Asian integration?
Well, first of all, I think there is a question mark among Asians here as to whether integration is, in any political sense, really possible or whether it's appropriate. There's been a degree of economic integration in East Asia, but India is still not really integrated with East Asia, still less Pakistan. As for what does the EU offer a model, I think the view pretty clearly among the majority, in probably everybody, is, strictly speaking, no. It cannot be a model. It cannot be a model because it arose from very specific circumstances at the end of a world war. It created something that is supranational, where governments are prepared to pool sovereignty, and where there is a shared commitment to the rule of law, democracy, freedom of speech, and so forth. And those conditions just do not exist universally across Asia. So the question is, what can Asia perhaps learn in the way of practical lessons from Europe and lessons in what you don't do? And I would like to think also, can the Europeans learn something from Asia?
Indeed. Your co-chair, I think it was, who described the EU as a large stately home, a Schloss Leopoldskron perhaps, with lots of nice big rooms, and the ASEAN, the countries that belong to ASEAN, as a neighbourhood watch. Do you think that's a good analogy?
I think it is. My co-chair, a charming lady, is a Singaporean, and this is very much a Singaporean expression. Very often you hear Singaporeans refer to their country as nice house, dangerous neighbourhood, because it is a sort of island of modernity and efficiency in an area that has historically been extremely unstable, and where many of the countries, as in other parts of Asia, have been on very poor terms with each other. And indeed, if you go back to the 60s, many of them were in conflict with each other.
Yes. Well, we are in an EU Schloss, but sadly for you, very soon you are going to be stranded, abandoned on the Untersberg. But since you're a writer, we're going to let you have 3 books on the Untersberg, 3 books which somehow relate to Asia.
Thank you. Well, the first thing to say is nobody's written a book that I know of that takes a synoptic view of Asia for the reasons that we were just discussing. So what I have done is to choose 3 books about the 3 most important, largest countries in Asia. 2 of which are by journalists, and one of which is, he's not a journalist, but like the journalists, it's clearly based on first-hand reporting. The second thing they all have in common is that they tell a different side of the story than the one that the governments of those countries might wish people to know. And as a result, all three of them were extremely controversial when they came out in the countries that they described. Now, in chronological order, the first one goes back to 1989, and it's called The Enigma of Japanese Power. It's by a Dutch journalist called Karel van Volkeren, and it was published at the very height of the Western phobia about Japan, when people said Japan is going to dominate us totally, there is a master plan, there is a great brain in the basement of the Ministry of Trade's industry that's trying to take us over. What Karel van Volkeren basically argues is that's absolute nonsense. There is certainly a system in Japan, and it's a system that operates in, as he described, a very peculiar way. I think it's a bit of a distortion and exaggeration. But what he basically said was, where does the buck stop in Japan? It doesn't stop anywhere. And that people are conditioned and restrained by a very, very restrictive set of constraints. Now, since then, of course, Japan has changed, or conditions in Japan have changed. It's been through 20 years of economic hardship and difficulty. It's sunk right back in terms of its share of global GDP and trade. It elected in Koizumi a most unusual reforming prime minister, and it kicked out the party that had been in power almost all the time since the war, which is the Liberal Democrats, and they now have a Democratic Party in the majority. But nonetheless, what is fascinating about that book, I think, is the meticulous reporting about little things like, why is it that they have British police boxes in Japan, and why is it that to this day Japanese school children still are dressed up in pre-First World War German school uniforms.
And they drive on the British side of the road.
And they happen to drive on the same side as the British, which is another peculiarity. And I think that it's so rich and wonderful in that kind of detail and descriptive. One can argue about its conclusions. The second book is a novel that came out 2 years ago called White Tiger by Aravind Adiga, who is Indian-born, I think lives in India, but Western educated. And it's followed this period when the Indian government and Indian business were doing these road shows saying, isn't India wonderful, you know, we're the coming thing. And I mean, it was good in a way to see them raising their profile, but I think for many people it all got a bit too much, because people said, well, look, hang on, I think you've got a 64% literary rate, you've got 500 to 600 million people living below the poverty line, and you're not doing the reforms you're going to have to do if you're going to keep growing. It was a very interesting corrective to that. It's a story of an extremely unscrupulous young man who's born in a fairly low caste, who works his way up to wealth and prominence by using all manner of means, including murder and theft. But the story really is about the environment in which he operates, the enormous endemic corruption in Indian officialdom, in Indian business, the way in which politicians exploit the poor, and it's very seamy. One of its great achievements is that it makes this really rather unsavoury central character actually quite human. You never like him, but you feel, gosh, you know, I can empathise with him.
Right.
The third book is written by a former colleague of mine, Financial Times, was the Beijing bureau chief, called Richard McGregor. It's called The Party, and it is about the Communist Party in China. And what Richard's basic starting point is that people think, oh, you know, there's a government in China, they've got a foreign ministry, they've got a central bank, they've got everything. But that, unlike in other countries, it's not that edifice that runs China. China is run by the Communist Party, with, it has to be said, some very successful results to date in terms of remarkable economic growth. It's brought China, it's done astonishing things, but at the same time, it is a very secretive, pretty corrupt, quite unscrupulous organisation. which in some ways exerts enormous authority over everything in China. But one of the points that Richard brings out very, very well is the limits to its power, how it is in constant contention with the provinces and the larger cities. The centre is always struggling to impose its will on the peripheries. And this, of course, goes right back to imperial China. Many people feel that actually the Communist Party grew quite naturally out of the structure that it overthrew. Yes. Well, it wasn't the communists, of course, who overthrew, but who succeeded. Very hierarchical, but very centralized. And there was, of course, a saying in imperial China, the mountain is high and the emperor is far away. And to this day, large parts of China still operate on that principle.
Guy, thank you so much for being our guest on the Untersberg.
Thank you.